Wanjiru, you have worked a lot on the role of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion on the legal system. To what extent has the DEI movement captured the legal system and the legal institutions?
I think it's entirely captured. I think that now when we talk about equality, civil rights in the legal system, it is going to always be understood in the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion, even if they don't use the acronym DEI, which is now regarded as toxic in many quarters. They still use that terminology of saying people need to be included, we need to see equal effects, equal outcomes, and also the language of diversity as a legitimate state policy.
Well, equality is normally considered to be with a positive connotation, and it is enshrined in many laws and in many constitutions. To what kind do libertarians have to accept equality? Do we have to accept equality of opportunities, equality of permission, or equality of result? What is the libertarian point of view on equality?
That's a great question, because the great overriding concept of libertarians is liberty, not equality. A lot of people say, for example, you hear people saying America was founded on the idea of equality. That's not correct. America was founded on the idea of liberty. And libertarianism is about liberty. Now, when we talk about liberty, we may ask, what does that mean? We have to kind of unpack it. And that's the point that I was making, that for somebody like Hayek, liberty means the absence of coercion. So for someone like Hayek, what would be wrong with things like DEI would be its coercive element. The fact that states are forcing people, to do whatever they've decided is a good social engineering program, and it goes against freedom of contract, freedom of association. That would be the way that Hayek would see it. For someone like Murray Rothbard, liberty is inherent in private property and self-ownership. So what would be wrong with DEI would be that it violates property rights and self-ownership. Now, when people say, well, but wasn't equality important in the classical liberal tradition? It wasn't important. When in the classical liberal tradition, equality just means treating everybody the same, regardless of their group or their race, their sex, whatever personal identity characteristics, treat everybody the same. In fact, this is what Ludwig von Mises says in his book, Liberalism. He doesn't say promote equality. He just says you cannot have special rights for special groups. That's what formal equality means. It just means treating everybody the same.
Would you say that anti-discrimination laws would violate private property?
Yes, absolutely. That's in fact that's explicitly what Murray Rothbard says. He says freedom of contract, freedom of association, freedom of conscience and belief means you have the right to discriminate. Of course you do. If that's what is the meaning of freedom of association if somebody's going to say you must not discriminate? Freedom is the freedom of choice, and that's the freedom to discriminate. Some people put it this way. They say you cannot have both liberty and equality. In order to promote equality, you have to encroach upon liberty. And in order to promote liberty, you have to encroach upon equality. So if you take something like freedom of contract, if I have the freedom of choice to make a contract with you, I also have the freedom of choice not to make a contract with somebody else. Now, they might say I discriminated against them, but that's what we mean when we say freedom of choice. If you say you have to make contracts with particular people, you're saying you don't have a choice.
You look to the political discussion nowadays in the United States or in Europe as well. There's a term of social justice, which is very popular with politicians and some part of the population. Isn't that a good thing, social justice, to achieve social justice?
That suffered from the same corruption as the notion of equality, because justice is a good thing. Justice by itself, we don't need a prefix to say what type of justice. In the classical tradition, we call something just because we think that it's good. When people start adding terminology, so social justice, global justice, racial justice, I mean, these days we have so many environment justice, all kinds of, that already is an indicator of the corruption of the word justice. Something is either just or it's not, and it's very, very important that we promote justice.
To comply with the requirements of the DEI, in praxis, there is often implemented some quotas, female quotas or quotas for ethnic groups. What is the problem about quotas? Is it the correct way to address the problem that some ethnic groups might be underrepresented in companies or in government institutions?
That's a good question. And my view on this maybe is different from many people, because I think that there's nothing wrong with quotas or targets as long as it's a private individual who freely chooses that. So imagine a businessman who starts a business and thinks, okay, I want 50% men and 50% women in my company. Well, good luck. Go ahead and do exactly that. I think the problem we've got now is the fact it's mandated by governments, and also the fact that it's publicly funded. So you're imposing this choice on taxpayers who don't get a choice whether to pay taxes or not. And then you take the tax funds and you say it's going to be allocated 50% to men and 50% to women. That's wrong, because that may not be what the taxpayers desire. So if I can give the example of Alabama, which has banned DEI, it's not banned for anybody that wants to do it. It's banned in public institutions. So anybody who receives public funding, schools, universities, or government employers. But what they're saying is, if you're a private businessman and you want to do DEI, well, go ahead, go for it.
What is your view then on the Trump administration's attack on DEI? They try to forbid it, and they have a lot of discussion with the universities in the United States, especially with Harvard. What is your point of view on that?
I think the Trump administration is right to say that DEI should not be publicly funded. They have policy reasons. So my reasons for being against DEI are more reasons of principle, because it goes against liberty. But the Trump administration is concerned with what they see as the unfairness of saying we're going to have, so they're calling it merit-based opportunity. This is what they want to introduce, because they're saying if you have quotas for race or sex, it means you are excluding people who should have got in on merit. And I think there's so many examples of that. If I can give the example of the medical school at UCLA that has been running quotas for years. So they just have a specific quota of, for example, white men that they're allowed to admit. And once they've got the quota, no more are getting in. So even people who are qualified aren't being admitted to medical school, while people who are not qualified, barely qualified even to do any job, are in the medical school instead. I mean, it's crazy. So that's why the Trump administration is trying to get rid of it. As you know, they've faced a lot of constitutional challenges, with people saying that DEI is just there to promote equal opportunities under the 14th Amendment.
Well, in Europe, we don't have any Donald Trump. What would you recommend Europe, Germany, Europe as a whole, to get rid of the DEI ideology?
In Europe, the difficulty we've got is the Court of Justice of the European Union. And I think that as many countries in Europe have discovered, you can, I think they had, this was in Poland and in Hungary, where they just decided, well, this is in keeping with our culture and this is what we're going to do. Immediately they face a challenge, the European Commission saying that goes against European values. The European Commission has this sense of what they call European values, of which anti-discrimination is one of them. And they have a lot of DEI policies. So that's what they're calling European values. And the danger, if you get rid of it, is you have these activists who will immediately be making complaints to the European Commission. I think already they do. They say, oh, we're looking around, we can see people who don't seem to be promoting European values, and you need to go, just ring them up and tell them to comply, which is what the Commission does. So it's how much room there is to maneuver, I think, is very, very limited, much more limited than people may think.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for the great questions.